Thank you. Hi, everyone. So, Joe, you are a fascinating character. There's a lot we can talk about today, but I know there are a lot of students and young founders in the audience who want to understand Google Ventures GV a little bit better. So tell me, first, you joined in what year?
2009.
Okay. And I know you're all sort of generalists to a certain extent, but what do you tend to specialize in something, or?
I love transportation because I think it's a huge market. The way we get around is going to change dramatically. Obviously, you've seen a radical increase in a mega trend of access over ownership. So over the last 10 years, obviously, people have gotten incredibly comfortable sharing their homes, sharing their cars, certainly ride sharing. And then I think there's another wave coming, obviously, with autonomy and self-driving cars and several other modes of transport around even flying cars, which we may get to later.
Yes, I love that. I'm fascinated by them, too. So tell me, if it's not an impossible question, what you're looking for in a co-founding team. Are you more persuaded by them if they've had success in the past?
Well, I mean, Google being Google, we do look at a ton of data around what's worked in the past and what's a potential predictor of success. And there is legitimate study. There's some Harvard University studies that have shown that, yes, if you have had a successful outcome in the past, that certainly you have a greater chance of having a successful outcome in the future. But if you only bet on those people, that would be a much more limited set. So yes, but prior experience of a team working together, my general view, having both started businesses, raised money, and now have the great privilege of funding other people, is that entrepreneurs, one of the things we all suffer from, I certainly suffered from, is I want to do it all at once. I want my business to be big all at once. I want to serve all customers at once. And so one of the things that I often try to coach people through, and these are the CEOs that I back, and also something I look for, is I think there's a really important order of operations to build your business in. So the first step is find a product that serves a need in a market that matters. That is by far number one and the first stage. So a product that meets a need in a market that matters. And I say market that matters because the reason VCs look for big markets is it allows you to make mistakes. When you have a tiny market and you make a mistake, you're probably dead. But if you have a big market, you can make a mistake and the market carries you along. So a product that meets a need in a market that matters. Second step, and it is the second step. It's not the first step, but it is an important second step. Deliver your product to customers with unit economics that are positive. There was a time at which venture capitalists funded businesses which were unit economic negative, meaning you lost money on every sale, and the story you told was that when you got to scale, suddenly you were going to be making money with each sale. Those businesses aren't really funded anymore in any meaningful way. There's a tendency of founders to get addicted to top-line growth, in my opinion. These are all personal opinions. And so you have this trade-off. You're looking at your business and you're saying, well, how do I get people interested in me? Do I sell more things? Do I grow my top line and look like I'm making more traction? Or do I focus on making a sale sustainable? Meaning, can I sell it for more than I make it for, or all the costs of selling it and some of the customer support costs that are associated with delivering it? And in my opinion, step two is unit economics that are positive. And then the third is, once you've done that, now you've got to figure out how you're going to grow your business. And this is a really difficult challenge because most businesses don't figure out how to control their own growth. They get caught up, if they're lucky, in a tailwind of a market that's really growing and they happen to be the leader in the space and they grow with the market. But if you can find a customer acquisition channel, be it search engine marketing, content marketing, or any other type of demand channel that you can spend money into in a positive economic way, that is the stepwise series of how you raise your seed round, how you raise your A round, and how you raise your B round. And so don't try to solve it all at once. Focus on one problem at a time, and in my opinion, and again, there's maybe differing arguments, that is the order that you want to solve it.
That's great. That's a lot to unpack. If we can go back a step, just in terms of the founders, I think it's interesting. I remember that study that you're talking about from HBS. I think it came out like a decade ago.
Yep.
And one of the points the researchers made was that it doesn't matter, or it does matter, I think, if you have domain expertise and you try something else. You're not necessarily, it's sort of like starting from scratch in the second thing. But you are proof that maybe it's something, some other sort of intangible, like perseverance matters, because you had two very different companies. You had this consumer-facing company with Excite, and then you had this sort of more enterprise-focused company with JotSpot.
Yeah, that's right.
So to what do you credit your success, or was it sort of the network, effect? You sort of have a team, you've got the confidence of investors.
So I was lucky when I was starting Excite way back in the ancient times of the internet of 1993 through 2000. My mentor was Vinod Khosla. I talked to him probably maybe 5 to 6 days a week for about a 7-year period. And I learned a ton. I also got into screaming matches with him at the same time, and I love him dearly. But one of the things that I really learned from him and that I seek out in everybody is this characteristic of great entrepreneurs, in my opinion, is what I would call irrational persistence. They essentially cannot do anything except persist along the vision that they're pursuing. And I learned this directly with Vinod. So a story from long ago, but that maybe is useful for you. It was 1995. The Netscape was the dominant browser at the time. It's hard to believe these are these ancient history days, but there were 2 buttons on that browser, and one said search and one said directory. This is way before Google and way before people just type searches into a URL bar. They went to a site in order to do a search. They were the dominant browser. They put those buttons up for bid. We had $1 million in the bank. And so I was all of 23 years old, and I was talking to Vinod, and I said, we have $1 million in the bank. What do you think we should bid? And he said, $3 million. And I was like, Vinod, I don't know about you, but last I checked, our bank balance doesn't have $3 million in it. And he basically made a point. He said, we're going to bid $3 million. If we win, we can raise it. If we lose it, we're probably dead. Oh, okay, well, that's one way of thinking about it. So we bid $3 million. I didn't know any better, and this guy seemed to know what he was talking about. So we bid $3 million, and we lost. And so I thought, oh, no, we're down this path that Vinod said if we don't win it, we're dead. And so Vinod and I were talking, and I said, what do you think we should do? And he goes, we should act like the bidding isn't over. What does that mean? So for the next 21 days, no joke, we sat in Netscape's lobby unannounced asking for a meeting with the decision maker. We forced his hand and got him to go out to dinner with us a couple of times. I'm sure he didn't want to, but our VC, Vinod, kind of flexed his muscle to get him in the room. And we basically made pain in the asses of ourselves for those 21 days. And when the guy who won couldn't deliver, we won the bid, and then it was off to the races. Irrational persistence is, in my opinion, the #1 kind of key characteristic of an entrepreneur. It doesn't make you successful, but it's a necessary but maybe not completely sufficient condition. And so I'd argue on this, there were kind of a couple of points out of that Harvard study that you were touching on. One is that when you go outside of your domain, you basically revert back to roughly the mean on your success, likelihood of success. And that's because you lose your network. And your network is actually incredibly valuable, the people you know and the people you might sell your company to. The second thing that I thought was interesting from that study, though, is that if you've been successful as an entrepreneur, you have a higher chance of success. If you've failed, you actually don't have much greater chance of success than somebody who hasn't tried and hasn't failed. And in my opinion, the reason is that we tell ourselves a really dumb story. There's many aphorisms we tell ourselves in lives. And one of them that I don't think serves us well is people say, I've learned more from my failures than my successes. I've learned more from my failures than my successes. I don't believe that to be true at all. I think the right way, I think what we mean, I don't think we're trying to fool ourselves. I think what we mean is I've built more character from my failures and my successes. But you haven't actually learned more from your failures and your successes. And the reason is pretty simple. If you think about all the path of a successful company over a 7-year period, and every day people are working, and let's say you make 10 minor decisions a day, but those decisions end up in a path that yields success. If you consider the total paths that you could take over 7 years and 10 decisions a day combinatorially, it's an enormous space. Failing only tells you that this path I took didn't work. Success gives you a pattern that you can follow in the future. And that's why I tell people who are looking to start a company, but they're maybe not ready or they're wondering to get experience, the most important thing you can do is get a job in a place with a culture of success and a pattern of success that you can learn and emulate. That is far more important. In fact, I would actually argue that in many cases, that is a better path to learning the pattern of success than shooting off on your own, trying something out, and it not working. Because, again, I don't think we learn more from our failures than our successes.
That's super interesting. Going back to, or I guess fast forward, you're a VC now, you're talking about Vinod Khosla. You're also talking about this emphasis on unit economics, and it does seem like this is cyclical. Sometimes VCs are maybe you're always focused on unit economics, but sometimes it really matters, sometimes it's like, let's scale first. But I do remember you saying years ago that when you were first talking to VCs, everyone asked you, how are you going to make money? And Vinod said, will your technology scale? So what's your takeaway from that? So it sounds like you would sort of be in the first camp. And either way, maybe what's your first question or your burning question for our founders?
I don't have a one particular burning question, but you bring up a good point, which is, just to rewind that story a little bit, we were meeting with a number of VCs, all of which, this is before the internet was really, or the web was even close to very large, and the business models for making money on the web were uncertain. We would get asked when we would do VC meetings, how are you going to make money? And that was a classic thing that happens when there is a massive disruptor technology like the internet. People get trapped in the old way of thinking because that's how it's been the last 20 or 30 years. And it's hard for people to make these leaps. And so they were asking, how are we going to make money? Are we a software company? And we said, basically, no, we thought you'd help us figure that out. And that usually shut down most meetings pretty quickly. Vinod did ask this question, which was not how are you going to make money, which is what we expected. He instead said, does the technology scale? And we said, we don't know. We can't afford a hard drive that's big enough to test. And one of the things that impressed us is he pulled out his giant brick of a cell phone. I mean, and bought us a $10,000 hard drive on the spot. We had to give it back. And by the way, it was 10 gigs for that amount of money. Show how old I am. But I do think you bring up a really interesting kind of high-level point, which is that it's really hard to have fresh eyes in this business. I think when you've been in the technology business for long enough, it's very easy to say, I've seen that, that's not going to work. And one of the things that I'm impressed by with people like Vinod is that he can keep really fresh eyes. And I think that's very difficult thing to do, to imagine why. Most of the time, when people say this time it's different, it's not. But the real money is made when it just happens to be. And that's really hard to know. And I'm always amazed at people that can do that well. I don't necessarily count myself among them.
Well, you are spending some time looking at eVTOL, the electric vehicle
About the
takeoff.
worst term for a segment I've ever heard. Flying cars.
Flying cars, right. But there's been so much talk about this. I had interviewed Niklas Zenström about a year ago, and he had just made an investment in Lilium Aviation, this Munich-based company.
Sure.
And we were just talking backstage with somebody about Air Mobile in Slovakia, and there's so much going on. Larry Page, the CEO of Alphabet, has 2 companies. It's so hard for me to sort of imagine that these things are going to happen. Now, GV has not made a bet on a flying car company. Are we going to see that happen anytime soon? I
can't predict that kind of when we'll make the leap, but we've looked a lot at this space. So have people just, I can kind of see folks given the stage lighting, but how many people by show of hand have read something or heard something about flying cars or electric vehicles that fly? So I actually think, I think it was, I don't think it's been published, but I think this was credited to Sebastian Thrun, who I'm not sure was here or not, but I think he said we're probably more likely to be flying around in autonomous vehicles before being driven around in autonomous vehicles. I actually think that's likely true. That statement was maybe made 3 years ago, and I think there's been a lot of transformation. But I think what's fascinating about the space is for these electric vertical takeoff and landing craft, the promise is that they will take you in local geography here. I'm not sure how many people are from this area from afar. So from San Jose to San Francisco, which can at peak traffic be a 2-hour trip, will take you there in about 18 minutes on a per-seat basis for the cost of an UberX, independent of the time of day. That is the promise. It sounds outrageous, but it reminds me a lot of how you might think about the iPhone in 2006. So the story I love about the iPhone in 2006 is when BlackBerry was the dominant company, RIM was the dominant company with the BlackBerry. There were all these rumors swirling about Apple launching a phone. And there were rumors about what it might be, a full touchscreen. And the folks at RIM were convinced it wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. They had tried to make that kind of phone. You couldn't get the battery life. The inertial measurement units weren't right. You couldn't get the thin screens quite right. It wasn't possible. But that wasn't quite right. It was barely possible. It had crossed a line from impossible to barely possible. And that's a really interesting line, because it's at that time that everybody thinks from the past that it's not possible. And flying cars, if you will, although most of these designs don't actually drive on a road, they simply take off like a helicopter, transition to wing-borne flight, take you somewhere, and drop you off like a helicopter, they're now barely possible. They're barely possible because of a series of advancements in various components, from battery densities to propulsion systems to sense and avoid technologies. And then what happens is usually somebody gives a space a spark. So one of the greatest services, in my opinion, that Waymo, Google's self-driving car company, Alphabet's self-driving car company, did to the world, in my opinion, is that they made people believe something was possible. And when people believe something is possible, a massive amount of investment flows into a space. People who are incredibly smart start innovating and working on it. It starts off usually as a small group of people with religious fervor willing a space into existence, and then it boils over into a moment where somebody credible makes you think this goes from impossible to inevitable, and then a whole ecosystem springs up. And we're gonna see that with these electrical vertical takeoff and landing craft. There are investments from companies in China like Ehong, who's done now 1,000 flight tests of their vehicle, which was on display at CES in 2016. Looks like a personal drone. Lilium that you mentioned, which is another design based out of Germany. There's multiple US manufacturers, large and small. So large like Bell Helicopter and small like Joby Aviation, which just announced $100 million of financing. And I think we're just going to continue to see a revolution in the way we get around. The sad fact is that if history and kind of academia show us what's to come, you would think that what we get is we're going to reduce our commutes from an hour and a half to 18 minutes. The reality is we'll move further away, and we'll keep our commutes at an hour to an hour and a half. We'll just live way farther away. But I'm incredibly excited because I think that there's going to be a radical transformation in the ease with which we get from point A to point B and the speed we can get there.
I'm still skeptical, but I would not have imagined all the resources being poured into self-driving cars a few years ago, as you note. You know, I had read a quote recently, or maybe it was even last year, sort of a self-interested quote. Elon Musk said something about, you know, there's so many obvious concerns. First, that they'll be relegated to the wealthy or regulations. But he mentioned fender benders. And he said, you know, what happens when your hubcap falls off and it guillotines someone? But I did think it was sort of, what's interesting is, you know, the flying cars versus going underground. Is that something that you're thinking about? Or do you think that that's sort of any more or less practical?
I personally feel like, and we, as a firm, have looked at a couple of the Hyperloop implementation teams that are there. I wasn't on those eval groups, so I can't speak with authority. But at a very high level, I just believe that transportation in general is about convenience, reliability, and availability and safety. And I think the future of transportation, to me, looks more like point-to-point than it looks like fixed rail. And so I think there's a real argument for why you could go underground, why that's convenient, certainly the speeds you can achieve. But I think for last mile, kind of urban air transportation, which is really what the eVTOL space is covering, I really feel like point-to-point is what people want if they can get it.
Guess we'll see in the next 10 years or so. Joe, thank you so much. I wish we had more time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.